We're dealing today with the painful issue of unresolved guilt. And we're doing this as a part of a short series about the relevancy, rather than the commonly perceived irrelevancy, of a biblical Christian faith. Christianity is at so many points derided and rejected in our culture, when it in fact holds the means for the resolution of so many of the ills which that rejecting society loudly complains of. And today we're illustrating that at just this one point with the help of ancient experience, the experience of David in Psalm 32. So once we've learned from the title of the psalm that this is a composition of David, we're told it is a maskil. Maskil is a Hebrew word whose meaning is a bit uncertain, but it's derived from a verb meaning to be prudent or to be wise. You get it commonly in the titles of Psalms, for example, Psalms 32, 42, 44, 45, 52 to 55, 74. You're getting the idea. It's quite a common thing. A maskil, a wisdom psalm. The thing is, it's being handed to us as a wisdom psalm, a song about the way of wisdom. And that seems to be important for understanding what's going on. We've been given an example to show us the way of the wise. Not the highfalutin intellectual, necessarily, but the wise. And perhaps for the benefit of those who lose their concentration and drift off when they're confronted with a big slab of Hebrew script, David immediately states his big, wise, overriding principle. He gets it in quick. So firstly, the massive, great overriding principle. It's verses 1 to 2. Blessed is the one whose transgressions are forgiven, whose sins are covered. Blessed is the one whose sin the Lord does not count against them, and in whose spirit is no deceit. That's what you need to know, says David. That's what you've got to remember. There's no denial of the reality of the nature of sin here. The choice of words is careful. Blessed is the one whose transgressions are forgiven. Well, yeah, I mean, the Hebrew word here just means transgression. Now, that's a personal sort of expression, really. You transgress against someone else. And in this sort of context in Scripture, this is particularly transgression against God. And there's the crucial, but obviously unstated, elephant in the room. The guilt that arises in our behaviour, which often seems directed at others around us, is fundamentally a violation not of their law. They have no more authority to make the rules than you or me. No, the rules to govern our conduct towards one another can't be the rules we make for other people, because we'd all make up our own rules just to suit our own ego and what we'd start defining as our needs. You can see, can't you, that if that was the situation, we'd soon end up offending and being offended by other people we need to relate to, who are doing exactly the same, developing their own set of rules for our conduct and our life in relationship with them. And life in society would rapidly come to a catastrophic end, because we'd all be demanding different things of one another, and it's going to end up with chaos. Now, David gets that. David's entire underlying assumption as he deals with this issue of transgression and sin is that it is the Lord himself, the true lawgiver, who has been offended against as we've violated the rules that he created to make human life and relationships work properly. Does it now make more sense when we read Psalm 51, verse 4? Against you, you only have I sinned, and done what is evil in your sight. So you are right in your verdict and justified when you're judged. Against you, the psalmist says to the Lord, against you only have I sinned. It's his law. When we transgress another human being's human rights, well, those rights were given them as part of their identity by God when he made us. So it is against the image of God and against his plan for humanity that we have transgressed. When we committed some act of violence and vandalism towards his creation, well, what we've violated is the Creator's plan and his blueprint for the world he has made. It's against his plan and his purpose for his creation, human, animal and material, that our transgression, crossing his line, and our sin, our falling short of his standard and our rebellion against his purpose, it's against him that we've kicked out. So whilst we do need to confess our faults to one another and sort things out, it is against God who reveals his plans and purposes to us both in our conscience and in his word. You can check that out in Romans 1 to 3. Against him that we've sinned, violating his standards and giving rise to both our guilt and the shame it makes us feel. And it's in terms of reorientating our relationship with God that David therefore writes, "Blessed is the one whose transgressions are forgiven, whose sins are covered. Blessed is the one whose sin the Lord does not count against them, and in whose spirit is no deceit." Who do we need to forgive our sin? Well, primarily, only God has been offended against. Ultimately, the offence against our neighbour is secondary to that. And therefore, it is getting to the place where God doesn't hold our sin against us that is the big issue. Blessed is the one whose sin the Lord does not count against them. But the verse doesn't end there, because the key to getting to that point is at the end of verse 2. This comes to the person in whose spirit is no deceit. Now there's the voice of a man who knows in his own experience what he's talking about. He knows in his own experience that the classic human response to being caught out in guilt and sin is to lie about it, to try to cover it up. I suspect you know exactly what it is that I'm talking about, and I have to tell you that if you do, then so do I. Let's get back to the origins of this sort of thing, and I'll show you what I mean. You remember what happened between God, Cain, and Abel? It's in Genesis 4, verses 6 to 13. "And the Lord said to Cain, 'Why are you angry? Why is your face downcast? If you do what is right, will you not be accepted? But if you do not do what is right, sin is crouching at your door. It desires to have you, but you must rule over it.' Now Cain said to his brother Abel, 'Let's go out to the field.' And while they were in the field, Cain attacked his brother Abel and killed him. Then the Lord said to Cain, 'Where is your brother Abel?' Get this. 'I don't know,' he replied. 'Am I my brother's keeper?' And the Lord said, 'What have you done? Listen, your brother's blood cries out to me from the ground. Now you're under a curse and driven from the ground, which opened its mouth to receive your brother's blood from your hand. When you work the ground, it will no longer yield its crops for you. You'll be a restless wanderer on the earth.' And Cain said to the Lord, 'My punishment is more than I can bear.'" Can you see what's been going on there? When challenged about his guilt, Cain just refused it and refused the shame. Look where it got him. "My punishment is more than I can bear." He lied about it. David knows himself what it's like to walk Cain's road. And he writes here in Psalm 32, 3-4, "When I kept silent, my bones wasted away through all my groaning all day long." I didn't go back to the Lord. I didn't get there and confess my faults to him. "For day and night your hand was heavy on me. My strength was sapped as in the heat of summer." Now that, here's our second point. We've looked at the overriding principle. Blessed is the one whose sins are forgiven, right? Whose sins are covered, who doesn't hide it up and lie about it, even to himself. Now we're getting to the second thing. Guilt's experience of backing off from God. Here's where it gets you. Verses 3-4. "The shame saps your strength and wastes you away." That's what unresolved guilt does. And your psychology affects your physical health and personality too. Psalmist is saying, "When I kept silent, my bones wasted away through my groaning all day long." A little while ago, I was travelling back from Machynlleth, at least a decade ago actually, and the pain got so much I had to drop into Bronglais Hospital, Aberystwyth, which is a great rural general hospital in my experience, where a doctor whose help I won't forget helped me out and told me that the worst pain is bone pain. It felt like it that day. But they helped me greatly, and then my life could carry on, and eventually I drove on home. And when David tried to keep silent and keep his guilt and shame covered, it was like an all-consuming pain in his bones. And there's no pain like bone pain. And when he denied his sin's reality, "No, I'm fine, I'll keep driving on as if there's nothing to see here," he not only exemplified our culture's denial and defiance of God, he discovered for himself the pain that causes. A pain that so many in our culture now bear and actually perpetuate, both by medicalizing it like guilt's a mental illness. When their problem isn't yet medical, it can get there if you just stick with it. And by turning to quack self-help gurus. No, you're fine, really. I know I'm not. We've got reason to be thankful that David's wisdom psalm doesn't stop there. Look at verse 5, because there's a clear way out of guilt's ghastly entanglement. You've got to get back, says David here, honestly to the one that you've sinned against. There's the general overriding principle. Then we come, secondly, to what guilt feels like, the way it affects you, guilt's experience when backing off from God. It's pain in the bones, strength sapped, as in the heat of summer. And then in verse 5, David turns to guilt's experience of taking itself to God. Then I acknowledged my sin to you, and did not cover up my iniquity. I said, I will confess my transgressions to the Lord, and you forgave the guilt of my sin. Could that transaction be any more straightforward? There's what was causing David his painful trouble. He calls it what it is. This is all about the guilt of my sin. You know, calling it what it is seems more than half the battle for humans. I have the trauma of the aftermath of my transgressions here, says David. I have a burden of iniquity here. I feel it, says David. I have the guilt of my sin rot in my bones and sap in my strength, as if I'm going down with heat stroke. Absolutely a life-threatening condition, says David. I confess, I confess, I confess. I confess it to the thrice holy God. Against you, and you only, have I sinned. And you, blessed assurance, says David, you forgave me. How does that work? The awful guilt of my sins. Okay, well, let's ask that question then. David, how does it work? We're dealing here, remember, with God. And you're going to say to me, well, you know, Jesus didn't die on the cross for my sins till generations, thousands, long time later. We're dealing with God. The eternal God. Which doesn't mean only that he stretches backwards through time. It means he isn't burdened at all with the space-time continuum. The space-time continuum doesn't limit or restrict him. Space-time continuum, what's that? I suppose you could say it's the parameters of what humanity can easily measure. It was Einstein who showed that time and space are inextricably mixed, right? Each readily observable event, he says, requires 3 space dimensions and a time dimension. That's how we can measure it. And that's why he said time and space taken together form the space-time continuum. He spoke of 4 dimensions, 3 for space, 1 for time, to relate to the material creation. Fair enough. Now, having said that, I do have a childlike understanding of string theory, right? I know physicists post-Einstein have for some time been telling us that the space-time continuum has no operational meaning for measuring and understanding things below the Planck scale. Roughly 10 to the 33 centimetres and 10 to the minus 43 seconds. I get this explains why to measure the position of a subatomic particle with higher resolution than that, we've got to use radiation with a smaller wavelength. We can't use sort of light and usual things. I recognise there exists the mind-bending possibility that many more dimensions exist out there. So string theory has been suggesting for over 50 years that the universe doesn't operate with 3 but 10 dimensions. I know. But look, against this fussy intellectual academic background, right? It might be best to see God not as just existing beyond space and time, but existing before, after, and also throughout all of the spiritual and material creation, and therefore transcending creation and time. Why have I dragged you through all that? I've done that because it explains what David's saying in verse 5. You forgave the guilt of my sin. How could God do that? In order to grasp what's going on here, and this is pretty cool, let's put a date to David. You might think that's tricky because Scripture doesn't use our regular calendar, and quite understandably, it doesn't say when David lived, quite right. But we've got this carved stone record, it's called the Tel Dan Stele, which mentions the house of David. Biblical scholars reckon he flourished on the basis of that. they reckon he flourished around 1000 BC. So for our purposes, general terms then, I think you'll see that's good enough. About 1000 BC, David. Whilst that's about 1,000 years before Christ died, what matters is that our sin is forgiven by the one against whom only we've sinned. And he, the creator God, is not the least bit constrained by space and time, by string theory, or by any more than 15 dimensions that anyone might care to theorize. He's not limited by that. So he's not the least bit constrained by the time lapse between David's confession of his sin before God and the sacrifice for his faithful, though sinful people's sins on Calvary's hill. Do you see that? I hope you do, because it's truly wonderful. Nothing can constrain our gracious and infinite creator God from forgiving the guilt of my sin, which was paid for on Calvary, even if that sin took place 1,000 years before, because he's not constrained by space and time. He is the infinite God. He does that regardless of space or time. When we take the guilt of our sin to our incarnate, crucified, resurrected, and glorified God, who lives and exists beyond space and time and isn't constrained by it. When we stop trying to hide or ignore it, and we take it to him. When we've treated life like our toy to play with as we wish, and when we've become distraught because of the way we've broken life, and we carry it tearfully wrecked with guilt to our Saviour, he's able to fix it. He was able to fix it for David, and he'll fix it for you and me. He can fix it if, here come the lessons to learn, verses 6 to 7 of Psalm 32. The lessons are learned, well, firstly, in dealing with the immediate crisis. Therefore, let all the faithful pray to you while you may be found. Surely the rising of the mighty waters will not reach them. You are my hiding place. You'll protect me from trouble, surround me with songs of deliverance. Three themes seem to stand out here, as we find in verse 6, the way to deal with the immediate crisis. The theme, firstly, of faithfulness. Let all the faithful pray to you. From Abraham's day onward, long before David, because God operates out space and time, remember, from Abraham onward, getting things right with God was always about trusting everything in life to him by faith. Trusting him. And here's a promise that comes not out of guilt records of performance, of compliance with the broken rules-based order in relationship, but by God's grace, not the rules. From Eden onwards, because of his infinity, it was always the way back to God, faithfulness, turning to him in faith. Let the faithful seek this course with their need to resolve the traumas of their guilt. Turn to God with it. There's the first lesson in dealing with the immediate crisis, faithfulness. Second one is turning to God. How do you turn to God? Well, I'll tell you now, it's the opposite of what fallen humanity immediately did when they were found out. When God came looking for Adam and for Eve in that garden, the first thing their fresh guilt taught them was to run and to hide from him. And when God challenged Cain about Abel, Cain tried to hide his guilt from God. The problem was caused then. And it is still caused in our world by denying the guilt that's eating us, running from God and trying to hide from the consequences that come from this. David says, let all the faithful pray to you in their guilt. And there's how the wise deal with guilt's immediate crisis. But there's one more thing in the immediate. Do it while there's still the opportunity. Do it while there's still the opportunity. Faithfulness, turning to God, while there's opportunity. That is my experience, writes David. So, therefore, let all the faithful pray to you while you may be found. Just getting back to God about it. This is not a thing you can afford to play about with. Guilt and shame must be dealt with immediately. Immediately. There's a time to act immediately, and this is it. Give you a little illustration. My mate Mike is a total engineer. Roots of his hair. He's in a wheelchair, but he's a total engineer. And to be honest with you, he's a quite amazing bloke. So there he was one day, sat at his dining room table, welding, I think, something to do with some means of transport he was constructing. And all I know is that a lithium-ion battery was somehow involved or quite close to the process. Now, I imagine you can see where this is going. His equally amazing wife was at hand to help with the inferno, and I believe it was she who conveyed the literally flaming battery straight to a bucket of water in the garage, where the material consequences continued to burn for some months. Like I said, he's an outstanding bloke. Now, I hope they're going to forgive me for any accuracies in my reporting, but I'm giving you an example of a couple of things here. However skillful we are at what we're doing, in a fallen world, things do go wrong, with us and for us. And when things do go wrong, they tend to have consequences. What matters is the speed and determination with which we deal with those consequences, and both the ability and the reliability of the place that we go to for help in resolving our crisis. So I've told you a story, but actually I've told you a parable. Yeah? Deal with it then. It's a crisis. And David is saying, do it while there is the opportunity. Get on it. And then in verse 7, he goes on to talk about the place of rest. How do we deal with all this? What are the lessons to learn? Well, in the immediate crisis, faithfulness is the key. Turn to God and do it quick while there's opportunity. And then he says, and then you've got to come to a place of rest where you can live. Verse 7, you are my hiding place. This is the outcome, you see. Here's the life impact. You are my hiding place. You will protect me from trouble and surround me with songs of deliverance. Why? Because I've gone back to you in faithfulness and honesty. I've gone back to you and turned to you in my guilt, my sin, not away. And I've got on it, dealt with it decisively and promptly. And so you've become my hiding place. And so in that relationship I've now got with you, you will protect me from trouble. And you will surround me with songs of deliverance. I'm in a place of rest. The faithful, guilt-freed person's place of rest is back in God's presence. Now it is exactly what was lost by the guilt that humans had picked up in Eden. Humanity sinned, and for its unredeemed safety had to be driven from God's presence. And we'd be daft not to keep going back to our merciful and all-forgiving God with our fresh failures there. See, the Christian life is not well lived resting on a past experience of sins forgiven, but on the everyday experience of refreshing our safety and salvation, taking the opportunity to wash away our sin afresh in his presence and resting the weight of our life there, living back in his presence, which is a foretaste of Eden restored. Time's going, so let's come quickly then to a straightforward conclusion on this whole issue of guilt and how we deal with it. David's song of wisdom to help us with it. Okay then, so what is it that has happened here? The psalmist recalled the agony he experienced prior to confessing his sins, all the time he was hiding them away. He affirmed that true happiness comes when our sins are forgiven. And then he urged others not to be stubborn, but to turn to God while forgiveness can be found, while it is available. And he stresses the importance of taking that route, because God shows mercy to those who are faithful and turn back to him, but people who choose to tough it out in their own guilt, without God, experience nothing but repressed guilt and sorrow. Not just taking your sin there, but bringing it there to him, to our habitual place in his presence, day after day, rejoicing in fresh fellowship with him, fresh relationship with the God who lifts the burden of our guilt and takes us back. And what that does for our human relationships can also be quite incredible. God bless you. In relationship with the God who forgives the guilt of our sin. May he deliver us from that wasting away in our bones, that having our strength sapped as in the heat of summer, when we hang on to our sin and our guilt. Set us free to rejoice in his presence with him. Have a great week.